Hello and welcome to this Farm Advisory Service webinar. My name is Seamus Murphy and I'll be your host this evening. This evening's webinar will mainly be focused on sequestration and storing carbon on farms. So in the previous webinars, we looked at an introduction to kind of COP26 policy, so what is going to be required of farmers going forward in the future. And then last week, we looked at how we can improve efficiencies. But throughout these webinars, I think the overwhelming kind of the overwhelming view of many of our panelists was that reducing emissions and improving efficiencies is not going to be enough to help us achieve our net zero targets going forward. So we're going to need to do more. We're going to need to sequester carbon in our land. So to help us understand some of these concepts and go through what we can do, we've got two great speakers tonight. Next slide, please. So we've got Lillian O'Sullivan from Teagasc in Ireland, and she's the head of the Farm Carbon Project in the Republic of Ireland. So Lillian is a researcher with Teagasc, and her main research interests are in sustainable soils and land use. She's no stranger to Scotland, however. She did an MSc at the University of Edinburgh in soils and sustainability. And as I've said, she's led the Farm Carbon Project, which mainly focused on carbon sequestration and carbon stocks in hedges on farmland in Ireland. So it's good to see that kind of perspective of what's happening elsewhere. And also, I do think that hedges are a carbon stock and possible source for sequestration that's maybe not as looked at as much in Scotland when in terms of forestry and even soil sequestration at the moment. We've also got Andrew Barbour, who's a farmer at Mains of Fincastle. Andrew farms with his wife Shonnig at Mains of Fincastle in Pasture, and Andrew has over the last few decades incorporated trees onto his farm, and that's something that has been spoken about quite a bit more now as we look at sequestration, how we can incorporate this agroforestry into agriculture going forward. So without any more from me, I am going to hand over to Lillian and she can take over from there.
Very good. Thank you very much, Seamus, and thank you to everybody who has tuned in to hear us tonight. So I'm just going to start to share my screen. So perhaps, Seamus, can you see that in the presentation mode?
Yeah, that's
just to
perfect.
Confirm. Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Seamus. All right, so tonight, really, I'm going to focus primarily on the Farm Carbon project that's ongoing. So I'm afraid I don't have any necessarily silver bullet answers as such. However, as Seamus pointed out, I think very often hedgerows are somewhat an overlooked aspect. But I suppose just briefly to tell you, I work with Teagasc, and Teagasc are the Agriculture and Food Development Authority in Ireland. And so our work essentially falls under three key remit areas. So we do research, but we also have advisory, and we also have education and training. Okay, so I suppose to get stuck in, I'll just mention to you that the project, this is just to let you know, it's funded by our Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine and the EPA. So led by the EPA, co-funded by the department, and just a nod to my colleagues who are working with me on this project, because it's actually no small effort to set about the task of trying to begin to understand what hedgerows might represent by way of a carbon stock, and also from a sequestration perspective. But as you can see, it's within this climate call, which is all about opportunities to maintain and enhance carbon stocks within rural landscapes. So in the scheme of things, it's what's considered a medium, so small medium project, and we have about another 6 months left in the project. Okay, so to start, I thought, even though you might think this is somewhat redundant, to share a slide that says what is a hedgerow, I'm not going to go through all of these different definitions that are listed here, but I think it's important to point out that in actual fact, there's a lot of different definitions that are used for different purposes. So while we might understand them typically as in agricultural landscapes, of course, as linear structures that have shrubs and trees, and they are acting as borders and boundaries. For many of these definitions, there's often a length or a width assessment criteria. So here's one from the UK, Bickmore, who says the definition is limited to boundary lines of trees or shrubs and excludes banks or walls without woody shrubs on top of them. There are many, many more definitions. I just threw up 3 here that are from the UK. I just wanted to put that out there because it's obviously something that makes it even a bit more complex when you're trying to think about these things. I also wanted to just throw this slide up there. Of course, we're talking about, or we'll be getting more into looking at hedgerows tonight in terms of the climate regulation potential. But of course, hedgerows are noted and often researched much more so in terms of their very important ecosystem function with respect to aspects such as biodiversity. So, of course, you know, hedgerows are really important in terms of wildlife, pollinators, erosion, shelter, shade, etc., etc. So they're very much a very multifunctional landscape feature, but tonight we're going to focus a bit more on the whole aspect of climate and carbon. Because of course, hedgerows are now suddenly becoming interesting as we're trying to find and look at different carbon pools that we have in our agricultural landscapes. I also wanted to just put this out there. I looked up when Seamus invited me to speak tonight. I had a quick look at kind of the state of play, as it were, in relation to hedgerows in Scotland. And while, you know, most of the hedgerows in the UK are considered to be priority habitat as designated under the UK Biodiversity Action Plan. So even though there's no full estimate of that, certainly it's estimated that the majority of the hedgerows in Scotland would be that. Similar species to what we have here in Ireland, hawthorn obviously is one of the most prominent or prevalently found hedgerow species, but in Scotland they're much more common on the well-drained soils in the lowland and are typically forming boundaries between the lowland fields. So we have something similar whereby much of our commonage is much more open and unenclosed. But certainly we would have a very extensive hedgerow network in general in Ireland, and I'll get into some of the numbers around that shortly. But there was some estimate that in Scotland the overall length of hedgerows had increased 7-fold from 84 to 2007 to about 212,000 kilometres, and this was primarily assigned due to agri-environmental policies. So similar scenario here in Ireland, where there's been quite a lot of initiatives related to agri-environmental schemes, whereby hedgerows are protected, but also there's been an effort to try to promote I suppose, certain managements, and also even the, you know, introducing new hedgerows into agricultural settings. Okay, so back to the project at hand. I suppose in terms of the context of it, we all are obliged to, I suppose, account in relation to these international commitments we have, such as Paris Agreement, our UNFCCC, so our United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We are obliged to, you know, fulfill our accounting requirements and so forth. However, hedgerows are currently not accounted explicitly. So for inclusion into this LULUCF sector, what you need to be able to do is to be able to show carbon stock changes over time. And that's very much falls in with the type of work that we're trying to do in this project. But very much we've these high targets as well, similar to what's happening in the UK also. But we've declared a climate emergency here. But also just to highlight this marginal abatement cost curve. So this is what's called a MAC, and that highlights the different pathways through which we can begin to move in the direction of the targets and how to meet them. So from what I understand, you spoke a bit about efficiencies, and often those will relate to this first one here around agricultural mitigation. But I suppose the agricultural sector, unlike many other sectors, actually does have capacity through land use and management to be able to sequester carbon. And so that's of course where things like agroforestry, hedgerows, or any type of management that can, I suppose, enhance a strong carbon pool becomes important, particularly now with the types of targets we're faced to meet. In terms of the existing research, what we've found here in Ireland in the past is that potentially hedgerows sequester between 0.27 and 2.7 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. So on aggregate, at the national level, this is potentially about 1.4 megatons. So a megaton is a million metric ton of CO2 equivalent. Now that's a wide range, and it's to do with different modeling approaches. One was whereby it was assumed that you plant a hedgerow and it increases year on year on year. But of course, we know hedgerows are managed and cut back, so it's not really a linear accumulation like that, in which case that 2.7 is more likely to be an overestimate in terms of that sequestration potential. But we do have through remote technologies, being able to see that we do have a lot of hedgerow in Ireland, estimated at about 689,000 kilometres. Now, that said, we are still showing that we've had a national decrease. Now, certainly it's not at the level of contraction that you'd see in continental Europe, for example. But what is important is that rate of decline has been reducing over time. So since I suppose they've become protected and so forth, there's less hedgerow removal, and they are protected as well through EIA. So if you go over a certain threshold, then you're expected to apply for an environmental impact assessment if you want to do farm restructuring and so forth. But what is interesting is that a lot of the hedgerows we have are actually dominated by low ecological quality. So what that means is, this was research that was conducted by a PhD who found that when she visited almost 100 more intensive farm enterprises and measured and assessed all of the hedgerows on those farms, what she found was by and large that they have low ecological quality. And what that means is that, of course, there's room to improve these, but I suppose what's interesting is very often the things that are good for biodiversity, for example, are also very good for carbon. So things like, continuity. So infilling gaps, etc., making sure they're connected and so forth. And often those things can go hand in hand and represent almost a synergy between these different ecosystems that we actually do need. Okay, so as I said, this project, what we're trying to do is something that hasn't been done before here, and certainly it's been done only in very few studies, is we're taking some direct measurements of hedgerow. So if you like, what we're doing is trying to relate measurements that are captured remotely. So if you have a flyover, it tells you how much volume is in the hedgerow. And what we're doing is then actually measuring measuring that hedgerow or a section of that and drying it and calculating the dry biomass weight and measuring it for carbon so that we can then begin to relate remote measurements to carbon stock. So the objectives are that we're going to quantify carbon stock from selected hedgerows, but this is not uncomplicated. So in terms of inventories, it's not a question of just this much volume, but in reality, for inventories, there are actually different pools that have to be accounted for separately. So SOC, our soil organic carbon pool, is recorded separately to deadwood, to litter carbon stocks, as well as that total larger biomass that you see. And from that, we will develop what are called biomass functions, and those are based on these remote measurements. And then we have a whole suite of modeling packages to see, can we incorporate the land use mitigation potential associated with hedgerows? So in addition to the biomass in the hedge, we're also looking at whether there is a so-called accrual. So do we have more carbon in soils under hedgerows relative to adjacent land uses? So can we establish that? And if so, can we develop then a correction factor that, you know, that tells us that this is actually good for our carbon stock in the soil as well. And also something that's very often overlooked is that below ground biomass pool. So to date, only one study I found in the temperate zone has looked at that, and that was a study in the UK in 2017. Currently, a group in Germany are doing that, but we are trying to do that here too, because certainly, while, you know, people think about the above ground biomass, the root system, of course, under hedgerows is extensive and certainly is a carbon pool that can be probably quite significant on aggregate. And then, of course, we're also going to develop, you know, some scorecards to allow us to be able to assess, you know, make rapid assessments of hedgerows and link those to some best management practices. Okay, so then this is kind of what the study looks like. So as I said, you have your hedge here, and you want to be able to measure this above ground part. But you also need to record the litter. So what's coming off as you move through the season, and how much deadwood is there in the hedgerow, and what does the soil organic carbon look like, and then what is the below ground biomass? So what are all these root systems likely to represent from a carbon pool perspective? And so what you see down here is it's related to the pools that are used for the LULUCF accounting. So as it's a relatively, I suppose, short project, what we've done is to try and capture from the what we call very managed hedgerows to much more unmanaged hedgerows across a series of ages. So what you can see here in between the two stakes is a section of hedgerow. This hedgerow has been flown over, and basically what we have is we have 8 sites. And while that might not seem very many, the volume of work involved is actually is significant, as I'll show you. So the first part was we went out and we were collecting litter samples, so that we would be able to understand how much litter fall gets cycled back into the system year on year. There was also an awful lot of custom field equipment that had to be made for this work, because there hasn't been a lot done previously. But of course, we had to be able to remove soil from roots. We had to be able to chip everything down, etc. And then we had the period where we did some destructive sampling. Here you can see it. Let me see, I'll just move this. Whereby we had sections and we had replicates across the hedgerow. Where here you see just the above ground, but of course we also excavated the below ground pool also. So then when we had this out, of course, there was a whole process of separating it into those pools that I described. Everything was chipped and everything was weighed. So here you can see we're in the field, separating out dead wood, etc. We also did the root excavation. Yeah, so as you can see, if you start to think about it, people talk about hedgerows as being an important carbon stock, but really they're only referring to the above ground. But in reality, what you have is you have a huge potential store of carbon below ground. So, you know, plausibly, this is very important too. And of course, we had to separate then less than even 2 millimeter samples, because those are counted as litter within the analysis and modeling part. And then it becomes very neat. You end up with these very nice samples that you take back, but then we had further grinding down. This is ultimately the size of the type of material that you need to go in for carbon analysis. We also did soil sampling at 2 depths. We took, as I said, under the hedgerows and also in the adjacent land uses. And of course, if you want to be able to measure carbon, you need to also take bulk densities. So of course, we took those as well, as you can see here, Mark, my colleague, doing in the field. So then modeling, what we've done is we've started to see, can this work in terms of national level application, and we have some new mapping products coming out, and in principle so far it looks like one can actually be able to do this relationship. However, we need to be able to correct for density and gappiness and so forth. So all of this is still a work in progress. But what we can see is there's still been a hedgerow decline, and this is consistent with other studies. However, having said that, there has been an increase, if you like, in biomass carbon stock. So plausibly, this means that hedgerows are getting wider and bigger. And of course, the more unmanaged irregular hedgerows are those that provide the best carbon capture potential. And then finally, just to mention briefly, we will be taking all of this information from all of the actual field studies, where we've also done a biodiversity assessment, and we're starting to, you know, we completed these quadrat surveys at site, and what we're doing is also seeing, can we relate aspects like biodiversity to carbon, and can we also begin to start to develop scorecards that will be useful for being able to readily score, if you like, but also link that then to maybe appropriate management practices. Okay, so in conclusion, very few studies, in fact, only one have we found have really started to begin to take direct measurements, so we can really validate this carbon stock. It's a very complex process to be able to try to look at all these different pools for inventories. But of course, the more projects we have and different work that's looking at this, then of course, maybe we can be able to apply these factors elsewhere. There are policy challenges and dilemmas in relation to accounting. Of course, we have, for example, area-based payments here, which mean that if the hedgerow encroaches too much on the productive area that's getting a payment, this is a lack of horizontal integration, if you like, from the policy perspective. Equally, you know, currently there is no accounting for hedgerows. So again, you know, these are things that need to be, I suppose, considered. And then, of course, you know, while it's relative to a base year and you're talking about a change, certainly anthropogenic actions such as coppicing or laying or anything that's part of an agri-environmental scheme can be applicable as anthropogenic land use management under these LULUCF accounting rules. And of course, I think it's always important to bear in mind that hedgerows, while they're an obvious carbon stock on our landscape, they also have so many different benefits that you know, I think going forward, it's likely with everything in terms of the climate and environmental challenges we face, that their importance will probably, they'll probably start to receive heightened importance going forward, and thinking and thought about how can we, I suppose, optimize or use this resource that's very often there to our best advantage, with the objectives of meeting some of these goals and challenges that we face. Okay, so I'll leave it there and I'll pass you back to Seamus and to Andrew for now, but hopefully, while we don't have all the answers yet, this work will be, it's ongoing. As I said, in the next 6 months, we should be able to come out with the results. Everything's kind of going through the lab at the moment. But yeah, looking forward to hearing what people think as well. Thank you.
That was great, Lillian. Thanks very much for that. I'm sure there are loads of questions after that. We have a few in already, but I did forget to mention at the start to make sure and get your questions in the Q&A down below. And there was a couple of comments in the chat, and I think you all should have access to the questions now. So I'll hand over to Andrew now. Just get the screen shared. And Andrew, if you're ready there.
Yes, hello and good evening, everyone. I'm going to be talking more about the tree side rather than just hedgerows, so a bit wider, possibly. And based on our experience here on this farm, we're a family farming business in Highland, Perthshire, and you can see we're very much an upland farm. So you may well think that what we've got to say is most relevant to the uplands, and yes, that's true. But I think some of the principles can be applied down to lower ground. Scale might be different. The emphasis, some of the issues and problems might be, have a different emphasis on them. But hopefully, there's something of relevance. Next slide, please. A quick look at the farm, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but cattle and sheep, and we are nowadays just a grass farm. Used to be a mixed cropping, but machinery outgrew us, basically. Too many slopes, but gates aren't big enough, and you wouldn't get a combine within about 7 miles of us. But very much upland. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all these benefits, but these are the kind of things, and you'll be familiar. I'm not quite sure if who's all joined us here tonight, but if you're farmers or policy people or students or whatever, you'll recognize most of these. But there's two I want to pick up on, and the first thing, carbon, that's what's driving us. So I'm going to come back to that one. And shelter, these are reasons for getting more trees onto farm. Shelter, I think, is a welfare issue. It's already a welfare issue, but it's only going to get more so. So you need to plant now for what's going to be happening in 20 something years' time. But what I hope to do is touch on the carbon bit a little more later, but really spend a bit of time tonight talking about what some of the problems are, and the problems that are thrown up to, from by people who say, oh, that won't work, you can't do it this way, you can't do it that way, and these are the problems. So I'm hoping to talk about some of the barriers which have prevented greater recognition of how you can integrate trees onto farms. Next slide, please. So you'll find a picture like this, which is taken some time ago on the farm, and a very, very familiar scene. And you'll know all about plantations. That's what the Sheep and Trees Initiative in Scotland, for instance, is all about. Quite straightforward. It's a change of land use, and normally driven by commercial interests. Shelter belts we're all very familiar with. You can see these are 3 shelter belts here, but they're basically designed so that the animals are kept out of them, and they're like mini plantations. And then we've been hearing about field margin trees and hedgerows, and we have these here too. Hedgerows are a bit irregular here. They tend to be blackthorn at our altitude, and they kind of go all over the place, but we like to call them hedgerows. But the bit I want to talk to you more about is wood pasture, which is what we've been trialing on this farm for the last couple of decades. And for those of you who are not familiar with wood pasture, it's obviously a form of agroforestry, but it's simply a land use system where three key components all have their interests taken care of. So you've got trees, and that means their regenerative needs are taken care of, are taken into account. Grassland and open land vegetation, and the animals that graze in them. So these three components are managed in some fashion or other. Grazed woodland, you might think, is wood pasture. Well, it is in one sense, but normally in Scotland anyway, the needs of the trees are not taken into account of at all, and it's not an ecologically terribly healthy situation. So wood pasture is what I want to spend a bit more time talking about tonight. Next slide, please. So the rationale is really for us has been designing wood pasture, which is going to allow animals to graze through amongst the trees, but still produce timber. So this is a very productivist kind of model, but it also therefore provides shelter. And there's a lot of biodiversity benefits comes from this type of approach. You've got a very large edge effect, which tends to be good for biodiversity. Anyway, this is a picture of one 5-hectare site, or a bit of one 5-hectare site we established in 2009. Next slide, please. And so it starts to look a little more like this is a few years ago now, and the alleys here of trees are centered on roughly on final crop spacing. And all that we've really done is to take the sort of plantation approach and miss out rows of trees every now and again, which would have normally come out in early thinnings anyway. So it's a pretty simple system in its design. And the aim of these in these tree alleys is, in these strips of trees, is to grow trees at reasonably tight density so that you've got the ability to select final crop trees from them. Next slide, please. So first of all, what are the things that people say about, oh, the cattle to destroy the trees would be a standard one. And yes, cattle rub on trees. But I think one of the key points here to make is that trees are much more robust around cattle than you might give them credit for. And the point it has to be made is that cattle are really a woodland animal, or a woodland edge animal. And so what the first thing to do is not to be frightened about the impacts that the animals are going to have on the trees. Yes, there's a bit of rubbing, and the lower branches, once the leaders are past browse height, the lower branches are going to be browsed off, and the animals do a good job actually in doing that cleaning job. But trees, providing they're not just single trees, are extraordinarily robust. The problem comes when you put just 1 or 2 trees into a field and then all the animals want to go to them. But that's when your problems come about. So key message here is, don't be frightened of getting animals in amongst trees, and particularly with cattle, they are woodland animals. They like being amongst trees. So there's a behavioral aspect in here that benefits the animals. Next slide, please. So as you can see, cattle are at home and regularly use the more denser areas, as you can see here, for lying up. And that point just can't be stressed enough. And though we tend to look at these woodland blocks in themselves, an important point here is spatial scale. The scale of these wood pasture blocks are big enough to provide, much bigger than shelter belts, so they're big enough to provide commercial quantities of timber, but they're adjacent to open areas too, and that is important. So if you were looking at the bottom part of our farm, it's a 50-hectare block of grazing land, and you might look at lots of little blocks of trees, but there is about 50% woodland, and it's got blocks no more bigger than about 5 hectares. So all the blocks are intersected by open ground, and that is an environment that really suits cattle, and clearly will do quite a lot on the carbon side too. Next slide, please. So sheep are different, and sheep are not woodland animals, they are open ground animals. And we took 2 approaches to establishing trees. And here's the first big problem that people throw up. Oh, we're going to lose the ground to stock. We can't afford to put lots of ground under trees. And yes, in the uplands, that becomes much easier to do when you've got more scale, and people tend to underutilize their vegetation in the uplands. So there is the potential in upland farms of bigger scale to change your stock management and create space to take land out of production for a short period while you get trees established, if you're then aiming to get the animals back in. And that suits bigger scale where you're trying to produce timber at a commercial scale. But the smaller areas where shelter dominates as an objective, we've taken the approach of just letting the animals graze through, use hot wire to keep cattle and deer off, and let the animals go through. And it'll work, but it works to a point, and you've got to be prepared to manage that. So we've got about a hectare or no more than a hectare planted in lots of little blocks like this, and we would have lost maybe about 10% of the trees through sheep rubbing. You can see a bit of damage after the sheep have been through these. They're all looking a bit drunken, these trees. But so there is management needed to steady the trees up and replace the odd cable tie, that kind of thing. But you can make it work without losing any ground to the sheep. But there's the point, I made the point, sheep are open ground animals, but I'd like to dwell on that just a little bit. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is ground, and we didn't realize how much the sheep were using this block. This is a plant. This is a sort of shelter belt which was established like a mini plantation, thinned. This is trees dating from the 1960s, thinned quite a few times in the 90s, late 80s, 90s. So it's actually created a good structure for stock now. We couldn't thin this nowadays because the scales are wrong and you couldn't get a machine up here. This is at 1,300 feet. But it's only when we got night thermal vision using for fox control, did we realize just how much the sheep were using the wood at night. And they rest up in this wood or most nights anyway. On a mild night, no, but on a cold night, yes. So it's not just in bad snow conditions. And that has big energetic advantages. So animals, even an open ground animal like a sheep, is keen to use woodland if you make woodland available to them. Next slide, please. And so most people think it's all about shelter, but in actual fact, the benefit, and it's not a very good slide, this, but the benefit in the spring is not from shelter to the lambs or the stock. That sure helps a wee bit, but the advantage is much more in the early spring grass. So here's another problem. People say, "Oh, you're going to lose."
Sorry, Andrew. Sorry, Andrew. Can I just interrupt you there?
Well,
you're coming and going a bit.
Actually, advanced grass growth in the springtime and also in autumn time under the canopy.
Sorry, Andrew. I just want to interrupt you there.
Open canopy because of, okay. right? Video off. No, I can't do that. That's I want to see what's. Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that seems to have improved things.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Sorry, I should have turned the video off, but thanks for doing that. I was talking about early spring grass growth. The other side of that, which is a big benefit to these animals, wherein they're at the greatest demand on them nutritionally a couple of weeks after lambing. But the downside is the reduction in summer grass growth. And that's something that has to be managed and balanced on how you manage the farm overall. And that is the big trade-off. So it's the benefits of early spring grass growth and clearly the carbon, behavioral benefits to the sheep, but there is undoubtedly a drop, and depends on the canopy cover, in summer grass growth. So that for us is not a problem in the areas we need the shelter, but in other farms it would be. But so that's something to think about. Next slide, please. And it's not the sheep that do the most damage to trees. And this is the next one you'll see. Sheep damage trees. The most mobile of browsers on trees are actually the lambs, and they can get highest up. So your trees, if you're establishing them, have to be not just above browse height for the sheep, but they've got to be robust enough to stand the weight of a half-grown lamb trying to get up them. And the leaves are highly palatable. And that tells you something else about it, that trees are actually extremely good fodder for animals, and animals seek them out. But so that's the big thing you've got to be careful of. Next slide, please. That's me. I want to just end on the carbon side. I don't have the data and the quality of data that Lillian presented to you. But just suffice to say that when we did our first carbon audit here, we were utterly depressed about it because the sequestration elements weren't taken in. The next version we did was a trial version of Agricalc, and that took into account the soils, which balanced out about a third of our emissions. But it still failed to take into account the tree element. Now, it took the tree element in plantation resource that we own, but not the wood pasture resource. And the wood pasture resource has a direct effect on your enterprise calculation. We've done that ourselves, and the current wood pasture element we have takes out another third of our emissions. So we would need another 5% planted of the farm under a wood pasture system. We would hit, on our workings anyway, carbon neutrality. We would be on a yield class 6 sort of site, 60% canopy cover, about 6 tonnes of carbon dioxide per hectare per year being sequestered in crude terms. And that's enough for me, I think, just now. Time's wearing on, and you're maybe not hearing me anyway. So I'll hand you back to Seamus. Thank you.
No, you were loud and clear there, Andrew, for the last bit, and that was great. And we have loads of questions already after coming in, and if you can keep them coming now during the Q&A. And I've got Robert, who is here, and he has been monitoring all the questions, and he's going to help now pose the questions to Lillian and Andrew wherever he sees fit.
Yep, excellent. Thank you, Seamus, and thanks to both for 2 excellent presentations there. First question, I think, goes to Lillian, if you're there. So
yeah,
can you put your camera on, please?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, perfect. Yeah.
Excellent. Question is basically about species choice, so about, and I suppose it's about conflicts as well. We've got our multiple factors. It's not just biodiversity, it's not just carbon, as you mentioned, it's biodiversity, it's water, it's everything. Where do you stand on monocultures and hedges? If we found a species that was really good at sequestering carbon, would a monoculture be the way to go?
Well, I think in light of the challenges we face, we know that our resilience comes from being biodiverse, if you like. So reasonably, you could selectively choose a fast-growing species that would accumulate carbon rapidly. However, you know, that growth rate obviously plateaus off, but equally it's less beneficial from a biodiversity perspective. So I would certainly think that you would need to consider having the right mix of species. I wouldn't see necessarily a hedgerow as something that becomes a monoculture. Having said that, I know that in Ireland, typically, if we're recommending planting, we would say that you plant maybe six plants in 2 rows per meter, and 4 to 5 of those might be your classic hawthorn. So, but having said that, you would mix in other native species with it, and then there's the whole element around managing that so that you end up with staggered heights. Some trees cut or across at a period in the hedgerow to allow for more carbon accumulation. But my inkling would be that certainly mixed is better. Yeah.
And I think, in Scotland, we've all touched on it, but we also have a biodiversity crisis as well. And certainly, I know my own farm, the hedges we've got are, no one could argue about biodiversity in them. It's a great abundance of resource, really, and certainly something, it'd be a shame certainly for chasing carbon and losing that biodiversity advantage. Loads of questions to come though. Andrew, one for you is basically about pastoral woodland. Does it fit with current forestry grants? Did you receive funding for what you did, or did you do it off your own back?
The answer to the first question is no, it doesn't meet forestry grant conditions now. There is one forestry grant, the agroforestry grant, which is present, but the grant aid is worth £9 a tree, and on the college estimations of SRUC's estimations of costs, it's cost you about £25 a tree. So there's been virtually no take up of it, and who could blame you? But they have used the approach that was used by the researchers in agroforestry back in the 1980s, and it was an academic approach. It's not a way to grow trees. It's a disastrous way to grow trees. It gives you shelter for animals, but it doesn't give you the timber. So the answer is, right today, no, there is no grant aid, and that's a shortcoming of our grant support system. Back in the 2009, I did use a grant aid system. They were so keen to get trees on the ground that they kind of didn't pay too much attention to what I was doing, and I was grateful to them for that. I was quite open about what I was aiming to do. They let it go through just to get the acres on the ground, but not now.
Yeah. Can I ask Andrew as well? So for your system, can we just revisit the net zero thing as well? So you said if we increase the area of grazed woodland by 5%, you would reach net zero. Can you give us that in numbers? So just remind us what size your farm is and how much area is in woodland.
Yeah, I'm talking here about a wood pasture model. So the farm is 500 odd acres, hectares, I beg your pardon, of what you would call agricultural land. If you look at the IX data, it's complicated because the IX data doesn't capture the extent of the woodlands, and that's a very important point for any policymakers or students or anyone. Farmers will understand that, but so 500 hectares of open ground. We've got on the farm boundary there, we've got a 40-hectare plantation. We've got 10 hectares that the IX system sees. Part of that is the wood pasture system. And that woodland sequesters, if you exclude the pasture part of it, and you take our wood pasture bit, plus about another 30 hectares of woodland on the farm that isn't recognized, isn't captured, but we reckon is, well, it's obviously there. That takes out about a third of our emissions, and that is about our emissions range between around about the 500 ton of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And our soils are doing about a third of that, and that wood element is doing about a third. So we would have to increase we would have to roughly double the wood pasture area to get us up to what we think is a net zero. But it's a crude back of the envelope calculation.
Yeah, and
but it's doable.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's nice to hear that, you know, it's achievable and it's not having a massive detrimental impact on your business. You're seeing the positives, and I think that's a really positive message, actually. Lillian, one for you. Did you have a look when you were doing analysis of hedgerows? What was there? Did you look into microbes, microbiology, and all that was happening there?
No, reasonably. Yes, this would be important, but you know, we just didn't have scope really for the timeline. But I would see now we are going to develop. You know, I think this was just the first of its kind type project that we've done here, and so certainly, yeah, there's going to be a whole other range of research questions that need to be answered, and of course, you know, this whole area of the micro is more and more important in every sense. Certainly we didn't look at it in the hedgerows, but I know in general in Ireland, the whole role of the microbiome now is becoming, soil microbiome is becoming very, very important, and especially for farmers too, as fertilizer prices are increasing all the time. Can we find ways for the soil to work itself? And that of course hinges on this whole area of microbiology. So in short, no, unfortunately.
Yep. Cool. Plenty time for more work, though. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this for many years to come.
Yeah.
What about, I suppose, to you both? So if we're looking at future policy and we're looking, you know, really interesting times both here and in Ireland, future policy, if you were in control, if you were in power, what would you do to make these systems more hedges and more wood pasture? How would you incentivize people, or would you incentivize people to get involved? So to both of you, maybe go to Andrew first.
I think the first thing is you actually need to have a driver, which is probably going to be based around carbon. There has to actually have to be targets which work at the individual farm level, not at a sectoral level. That's not where the decisions are made. They're made at the farm level. So you need that driver, and then you need both the advisory service and the grant system to support you make those changes. There's lots of other things, but in short, those are the things you need.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. You know, it's something that we, I suppose, would have fallen victim to maybe in the past in Ireland, was the notion that, you know, climate targets are national, so we can offset it somewhere else, or someone else can figure it out. But you're right, in reality, and I think what is needed is that driver, but also that response at farm scale is critical. But also I think fundamentally we have some you know, pressing issues that already need to be reconciled, where we have policies in existence that are contradictory to each other currently. Certainly in Ireland, it sounds a little bit too, with the IX in Scotland, that there is an issue with potentially very valuable resources already on farm that are not being given any credit for. But similarly, as I mentioned earlier, we have challenges around the fact that, you know, what's beneficial for one service is also at the same time being penalized in another policy. And so some of that horizontal integration needs ironing out urgently in the first instance. And then, of course, incentivization. And of course, we hear as well more and more different creative ways around potential credits or schemes and so forth. But, you know, there's a lot of work, I suppose, still to be done to be able to exploit some of those opportunities and to make sure they're viable and practical on farm at a farm level, certainly.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you on that, Lillian? Because Andrew mentioned it as well when he was talking about some of the wood pasture not being kind of attributed to his farm carbon footprint, and you mentioned there that the hedges, sometimes some of their kind of the policy goes against what you actually want to achieve. How do we go? Or is there any kind of changes being made in Ireland, or what's the kind of way things are going? Because I know in previous webinars, farmers have asked that. They've kind of highlighted that there's all of this here that isn't being attributed to the farm and business, and it kind of comes down to that on a national scale, that land use change, and forestry is separate to agriculture. Even though they should really be linked.
Yeah, well, I suppose in terms of changes, of course, it hasn't yet happened, but there is a lot of discourse around the fact that, production and biodiversity targets are currently in contradiction. And so there are talks that this is going to be addressed. But I suppose a bigger challenge is that with the accounting, you have a scenario where it's only changes relative to a base year. So, potentially if we have a declining area of hedgerows in Ireland, which potentially we do, then they become listed as a source rather than a sink. Now, I suppose the other aspect is that there are a lot of aspects to that sink that I think need to be exposed, and that's part of what this work is about, that will allow us to better understand things like the root biomass and some of those aspects that aren't mentioned at all. We do see more and more integration of agriculture, forestry and other land use, but there is only well, I'm not sure of the scenario in the UK now, but certainly under the EU legislative framework, flexibilities were provided for member states to be allowed to use a proportion of their land-based offsetting. Now, that's one thing, but I suppose we probably need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond that. We need to start rewarding better, maybe, through incentives or even market initiatives that will allow farmers get credit in a meaningful way, at farm scale, that will make sure that something that's quite important isn't lost effectively, or ignored ultimately.
Yeah.
Can I just add encouragement to the market incentive? We've got to get the market working to reward what we're talking about. And if we don't do that, our businesses are going to fail. We have to get market mechanisms working.
And I think, Andrew, if you look at where particularly the dairy industry is a wee bit further on, probably, they're coming from a different point in that they've got individual contracts. But when you see where the dairy processors are coming from, they've really latched on to certainly carbon and biodiversity alongside that. So it's interesting to see that, obviously, just in the last couple of years, how fast that's going. And in actual fact, they're moving a lot faster. Government wheels turn slowly, no matter where you are in the world, whereas the market tends to react an awful lot quicker. And it's interesting to see where the dairy guys are, but also how our beef and sheep business is very different in that we generally work to an open market, and we're not tied into a contract. So it's it'll be interesting to see that develop. But I think I'm optimistic that the market is getting in gear for that.
I hope so. Yeah, good.
Yeah. I'm conscious there's a lot of there's good questions there and bits and pieces. There's I think there's 3 questions really, just to summarize, is I suppose it from a holistic perspective, the role of these woodlands, wood pastures, hedgerows. I mean, there's so many. We could probably sit all night and list the individual outcomes, the benefits from it, that they're so vast, and certainly something I'm sure we would all encourage, as a panel and probably as a whole audience, that seeing more grazing, more trees integrated into grazing land in the right place, and certainly hedgerows into back into areas would be a huge positive, a win across all boards, right down to microbes and fungi and all the things that really matter that we can't see. So does either speaker, I suppose, do we have anything to add? Is there anything we've missed? There's been some excellent questions coming in there, and I'm not sure how good a job I've done of representing them all. But also conscious of time, so we're just over time. So,
well, I suppose something that hasn't really come up, but I suppose it's important, and it's something I'm trying to liaise with different people, farmers in particular, and advisors. It's all very well making these best management practices and so forth, but I suppose that there is a need, I suppose, to engage with all of the different stakeholders, and even from, as Andrew and yourself have pointed out and highlighted as well, just the role of different actors in this. And it's certainly a need at farm scale for some kind of mechanisms that support these facets of farm scale, but equally, who else has a role to play here, and I think that whole idea of all of the different stakeholders having to contribute to finding some solutions here is important,
Yeah, brilliant.
Can I just very quickly add the difficulty of offsetting? We see planting woodlands as being offsetting what you're doing, on your farm, but offsetting is a risky option, and it's risky in presentational terms, and it's risky that we are going to be outgunned in finance by much, much bigger businesses. So and that issue has not been addressed in Scotland. I don't know about Ireland, but it's a really big one. So it's something to flag up. It's too late in the day to discuss it much now, but it's a big issue.
I think it's the same issue, what I was saying there, on a positive context, as the market moves quicker than the government. It's exactly what's happening there too, is that land is an opportunity at the moment, and certainly in the southwest of Scotland, we are seeing, it's becoming a big issue. Great if you're trying to sell a farm, but otherwise, a big challenge. But anyway, enough from me. Thank you to you both. That was excellent, and I'll hand you back to Seamus.
Yeah, and just a final kind of comment there that came in from Stephen McKenzie, and it just says we need to make policymakers aware that we wish to try new and novel methods, but require support in order to persuade many farmers that they're not losing farm area. And I think that's a good comment, a good message. And if hopefully there are policymakers that are listening now or will listen to this webinar and other kind of farm advisory service stuff. So again, last week I touched on this, and I'm going to touch on it again because I think it's really important. Some of the things that are going to be happening in Scotland, in Glasgow and online, you've got the UK government Green Zone events, which there are some events that are focused fully on agriculture, different ones focused on biodiversity, a lot of land use there. So I think they've all sold out now, so you won't be able to attend, but they're all going to be on YouTube as well, and they'll all be online. So if you follow COP26 on YouTube, you should be able to join those webinars as well. And it's important to see what other people are doing all over the world, because farmers everywhere are going to be getting asked and being asked the same questions that you were being asked. Nourish Scotland as well have a recipes for resilience, where they're trying to bring kind of food into the kind of total picture at COP26. And that's, I think that's an in-person event, and I'm not sure if it's ticketed or anything like that. But if you Google recipes for resilience or on Nourish Scotland, you should be able to see what they've got lined up. Again, there's a global day of action, a kind of a protest, I suppose, on the 6th of November. Different areas around Scotland are having kind of different kind of get-togethers or gatherings. And as I said last week, there's a section in there kind of in that relates to farmers and land use. So you're wanted, you're welcome, your voice should be heard at these. And then just another thing to touch on, that there's loads of different events happening. we'll try and keep you up to date with a lot of it on the Farm Advisory Service, Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. But just keep an eye out, and it's really important that like Stephen said there in that last comment, you know, that we let policymakers know, we make sure that our voices are heard. And this is a unique opportunity with COP26 being in Glasgow, and the eyes of the world will be on Scotland. Before I go, thanks very much to Lillian and Andrew. Particularly, you might not have noticed, but we had technical difficulties just before we started, and Andrew just managed to join. So a particular thank you to Andrew for holding it all together, and Ian in the background for making sure that Andrew got on. And I think no one would have known that there was any technical difficulties, which is good. But thanks very much for everyone for joining tonight, and we'll see you again next week.